Good morning and welcome. I'm Jim Paterba, and on behalf of the NBER, I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting on the labor market after the Great Recession. It has been an extraordinary 4 years since the turning point that marked the beginning of this recovery. If you turn back the clock and think about the discussion that many of us were engaged in 4 years ago, there were questions about whether we were in a sharp V with a very steep decline during the recession that would be followed by a very rapid period of recovery. And it is now clear 4 years after the fact that V was the wrong letter. L was closer to the mark, particularly with respect to the labor market, and that we've experienced a period of truly historic developments within the U.S. labor market. That, of course, was the motivation for a research project on recent developments in U.S. labor markets. The statistics that motivate this project and thinking about these questions, of course, are known to all of you. Employment at the low point of the downturn was about 6% lower than before we started into the recession in late 2007. Even today, 4 years on, we've had an unemployment rate of 7.6%. The employment to population ratio in the U.S. has fallen strikingly by nearly 4 percentage points since the period 5 years ago. Long-term unemployment is at historic highs. The numbers that I saw suggest that there are about 4.4 million workers today who've been unemployed for more than 6 months. That represents about 37% of the unemployed. If one looks back historically, there were never periods when we got above about 25 or 26%. So things have been different in the U.S. labor market in the last 4 years. And it's consequently an exciting time to be studying these developments and trying to understand what the implications are for thinking about policy. If one casts back the clock further and compares the recovery that we are currently in with those in past years, one of the great challenges in contrasting labor market developments and output developments is that we seem to have much slower labor market recovery than we did in, say, the 1970s or 1980s. And what used to be a pattern that looked much closer to a V seems to have changed into something which looks much closer to an L. And this recovery is not all that much different in terms of job growth from what one saw, for example, in 2001. So the set of questions that one tries to understand, I think, with regard to labor markets and the current recovery are, why is it different this time? In what dimensions is it different this time? And have we entered a new period in terms of business cycle developments that suggest a different dynamic plays out as one moves through the recession and into the recovery period? If you think about the major issues that have emerged as labor economists, macroeconomists, public policymakers have struggled with these issues in the last few years, sectoral shifts, the extent to which the rapid run-up in unemployment could be attributed to a shift in the patterns of demand across sectors in the U.S. economy versus traditional sort of Keynesian-style demand-based unemployment. The degree to which changes in the social safety net explain the long periods of unemployment we were seeing, and to the extent to which supply-side aspects of the labor market were playing a role as opposed to demand-side from the firms looking for workers. The differential developments in the private sector and the public sector. Substantial declines, of course, in public sector employment in the last few years in a period when the private sector has at least recently begun to hire at a more substantial rate. So all different pieces that fit together to understanding where we are. With that as a backdrop, I was very grateful when David Card of Princeton, of Berkeley, and Alex Moss of Princeton agreed to, David occasionally of Princeton, currently of Berkeley, when David and Alex agreed to take the lead in organizing a major research project that was going to look at the developments in the labor market since the onset of the Great Recession. Several weeks ago in Cambridge, we organized a research meeting at which there were 13 different research papers, 47 economists gathered to talk about their findings, and with the support of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which has graciously underwritten this project, we not only were able to support the research projects on these various topics, but to come here to Washington to try to better communicate and talk about some of these findings so that we could enable the public policy community to learn better about what we are doing. I was particularly grateful to To our three moderators this morning, David Wessel, Catherine Rampell, and Greg Ip, all of whom are amongst the leading authors in the journalist cadre on thinking about labor markets and the macroeconomy, and all of whom will help to lead our discussions as we proceed this morning. What we've done is to pull together a group of researchers and folks with public policy expertise to address the core issues that the broader economics and public policy community has been tackling with regard to labor markets over the course of the last 4 years. And this morning's conversation is all on the record. I would just remind everybody of that as we start. We also have a video which we'll eventually post on the NBER website. But this is an opportunity for us to share the findings in an open dialogue setting, to bring others who were not part of the research project but could also share their views on what's been developing in the labor market, and to talk about the various issues that are on the table as we go forward, the unresolved questions that we need to understand, the lessons of the last 4 years, and of course what the implications are as we think about public policy. The NBER by charter, which was founded actually around a set of issues in labor economics. Two of the NBER's founders had met. They were a senior corporate vice president at AT&T and a Marxist labor economist trained at Columbia in the 1910s. They met on governor's commissions in New York, talking about things like should there be a minimum wage and should there be a maximum hours constraint. They had different views about the answers to those questions, but both realized there was no data to speak to those issues, and that led to the foundation of the NBER and the creation of a data generation organization. They wrote into the charter that there wouldn't be any policy recommendations in NBER publications, but that doesn't mean that we can't discuss issues that are highly relevant for policy, and of course that's what we'll be doing this morning. The morning is broken basically into 3 different panels. The first will talk about productivity and sectoral shifts, questions that of course emerged right after the downturn as the question, where did this very high and very steep increase in unemployment come from, were discussed. The second focuses on the changing role of the social safety net, and then the last talks about the social cost of unemployment and the issues that we've been experiencing. The first moderator was David Wessel, and the panelists in the first session are my MIT colleague and now the chief economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, John Haltiwanger of the University of Maryland, one of the people who is well known to all of you as an expert on the dynamics of gross flows in the U.S. labor market, Eddie Lazier, leading expert on what goes on inside firms, thinking about personnel markets, and of course the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and Justin Wolfers from the University of Michigan, who, while we don't think is here yet, we have launched the panel in the hope that we will see him before the end. Just in time. We hope. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to David, who will take it away. Thank you all for joining us.
You can see what my role here is. John and Eddie are going to make presentations, and then Olivier is going to respond, and then Perturber is going to do his Justin Wolfers imitation if Justin doesn't show up. So John, do you want to start?
Sure, great, thank you. Okay. So my remarks today are based upon this work we've done for this project, and it's collaborative work with Lucia Foster and Cheryl Grimm, who are both here. So what we went to look at was the nature of reallocation dynamics in the Great Recession in particular. But we wanted to do, as Jim was talking about, put it in perspective from earlier periods. So we know, many of us have been studying these reallocation dynamics for some time, and we know the U.S. is characterized by a high pace of job creation and destruction. And indeed, this first figure shows 2 series, one from the Census Bureau, that's on the left, one from the BLS, equal time here, on the right. Both series have advantages and disadvantages. The Census series goes back to the early 1980s. It's annual. The BLS series is quarterly and somewhat more timely. So the first thing hopefully you see, and again well known, is the U.S. does actually have a very high pace of job creation and destruction. So if you look at the annual rates, they're in the 15 to 18% kind of rate in terms of creation and destruction. The quarterly rates are in the 7 to 8% range. Another thing that many of us have worked on is that this very high pace of creative destruction in the U.S. economy is productivity enhancing, and that'll be a theme as we go through the results. Now, our focus here is what happens to these reallocation dynamics over the business cycle. Historically, by historically I mean in terms of what we know from the data before the Great Recession. A number of us have found that what happens in recessions is that there's an increased intensity of reallocation that occurs during recessions, and it occurs in a particular kind of way. So let me describe that. What we've seen in past recessions, and you can see this in this figure, is that in recessions we see a sharp rise in job destruction and a relatively smaller decline in job creation. So a simple concept, job reallocation. We've got Justin here. Come on, Justin, join us up here. We've got job reallocation rising as a result of that, because job reallocation is just the sum of creation and destruction. And to the extent that this reallocation, I've already hinted that we think we know, and I'll give you some evidence of this, that this reallocation is productivity enhancing. What this says is that recessions are a time in which this productivity enhancing reallocation accelerates some, right? Because if indeed the destruction is shutting down and contraction of lower productivity businesses, then indeed we've accelerated that process. And to the extent that creation didn't fall completely symmetrically, that means at least some of that resulted in moving resources away from less productive to more productive businesses. So that's what we thought we knew before the Great Recession. So even in this figure, I know it's pretty small and so on. Hopefully you're going to see, and I'm going to make it easier for you in just a second. Things look different in the Great Recession. What happened in the Great Recession? Job creation took a really big hit, a much bigger hit than in any of the recessions that we've seen before. Job destruction rose. Job destruction patterns actually look kind of similar to previous recessions. So if I just showed you the job destruction figure, you'd actually think that the Great Recession was kind of like the 1982-1983 recession. So sharp rise in job destruction. So lots of layoffs, lots of job destruction, but this came down pretty quickly. Indeed, job destruction is below pre-recession levels. You can see that clearly in the BED. So what hasn't happened? Well, job creation took a really big hit and has not recovered. So to help us with this a little bit, in terms of sort of the differences between the reallocation dynamics, here I'm just showing us a simple calculation we made, which is what fraction of the net declines that occur in recessions is accounted for by job creation. Before the Great Recession, what we saw is this number is well below 0.5. So what that, again, it's just repeating what I said earlier. It says that in net contractions, what we see is destruction is the primary margin, not so much creation. But in the Great Recession, that changed dramatically. So indeed, what you sort of see is actually well over 50% is accounted for by the decline in creation. Now to push a little bit harder on this is what kind of businesses took an especially large hit in terms of the decline in job creation in the Great Recession. It was young businesses. And so what we sort of see, again, kind of a main first set of points in our paper is we see a change in the nature of reallocation in the Great Recession. It was especially a large decline in job creation, and especially large decline in the job creation for young businesses. Right? So now we want to go turn to productivity. So do we see something different in the nature of the connection between productivity and reallocation in the Great Recession? And the answer is yes, we do. So here I've got a very simple chart, and let me walk you through each of the bars. So the bar on the far left is I'll call it normal times. That is, it's a time in which we're not expanding or contracting, and we're just characterizing in the cross section the relationship between productivity and reallocation. And what do I mean by that? Well, what we see here, that you can see here that it's the growth rate differential between businesses that are one standard deviation above mean productivity within an industry and one standard deviation below. And you can see that that's a pretty substantial differential. It's about 10%. So that says year in, year out, what's going on in the U.S. economy is we're moving resources away from less productive to more productive businesses. That's evidenced in terms of this difference in the growth rates across high productivity and low productivity businesses. In prior recessions, what we found is that this productivity-enhancing reallocation actually became even more productivity-enhancing the more severe the contraction. The way you can see that in the next two blue bars is indeed, we're using, by the way, state-level data here to achieve identification. What one sees is that the reallocation, the difference between a high productivity and low productivity businesses actually increases the sharper the contraction. But when we turn to the Great Recession, that flips on its head. Instead of the difference increasing as the contraction becomes more sharp, it actually decreases. Now to be fair, I don't want anybody to go away thinking, oh, that the recession was actually a time in which we were actually moving resources away from high productivity to low productivity businesses. That gap on the far right is still quite positive, all right? But it is the case, instead of the reallocation becoming more productivity enhancing, it becomes less productivity enhancing. This is tied to theories that many economists have talked about, which is that recessions may be a time of a form of cleansing in the economy. And when you hear that term cleansing, this is not a statement that recessions are a good thing. Okay, I certainly don't want to be on record for that. But the conditional on a recession occurring, maybe it accelerates the kind of reallocation dynamics that is productivity enhancing in the United States. And indeed, the evidence suggests that in the past that was true, but that's not true in the Great Recession. Last slide, and then I'll try to bring this home in terms of what do I think this all means and how to put it in perspective for the kind of things that Jim was talking about. We find that these effects that I'm talking about are dominated by young firms. That indeed, there's an especially large differential in the growth rates between high productivity and low productivity young firms. Those effects, those marginal effects, are especially impacted by the Great Recession. So let me try to summarize what I think this evidence plus some closely related evidence suggests that was different about the Great Recession. So in the United States, we benefit substantially by having a highly dynamic, highly flexible economy. And what we found in the past is that while recessions are tough, obviously, those reallocation dynamics actually become somewhat more intense, and we get a productivity gain out of that. In the Great Recession, we didn't see that. We saw a lower intensity of reallocation. We actually saw it, instead of becoming more cleansing, it became less cleansing. Now, what I've talked about is much about sort of the what of what happened. So why has this happened? Well, I think the biggest hint in our work is the effects on young firms. We have found that indeed young firms got hit especially hard in the Great Recession, and it was especially on the young firm dimension that we saw this less intense reallocation, but also we saw this less cleansing reallocation. Let me talk a little bit more, last remark about young firms. So one of the things I didn't talk about in the first slide, actually I intended to, is I talked about the overall pace of reallocation, and I talked about the cyclical dynamics. Many of us have noticed there's a declining trend in the pace of reallocation. So the US is becoming less dynamic over time. Do we fully understand that at this point? No, but we do know one of the key contributing factors is there's a declining trend in the business startup rate in the United States, and there's a much lower share of young firms in the United States than there used to be. To the extent that these reallocation dynamics and indeed young businesses are part of the ways that the U.S. experiments, reinvents itself, and actually adjusts, this means the U.S. has become, I'll say, less dynamic, less entrepreneurial, I'll say even before the Great Recession. So in some sense, we were not as well prepared to be able to deal with adjustment in terms of these dynamics going into the Great Recession compared to, for example, the 1982-1983 recession. So in combination, what we see is that young businesses were already, you could say, in trouble in terms of a lower pace of entry and a smaller share, and therefore lower dynamics, even going into the Great Recession, and they got hit especially hard. So back again to the kind of hard questions that Jim's talked about. You know, do we understand why things were so different? No, in some sense, again, I've given you more about what than why. But we think part of the answer is to look at young firms. Why they've had such a hard time, I'll say, even before the Great Recession and certainly during it. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think the subtitle of this presentation is Great U.S. is Becoming More Like Europe. Is that the idea?
Yes.
Eddie?
Okay, how do you do this here? Yeah, let's see. I need to get to the front page. See my name. Good. Okay. All right, well, I'd like to cover 3 topics in 5-6 minutes, so that's a lot to do. The first one is based on the NBER conference that Jim mentioned earlier, sponsored by both Alex and David, and thank you guys for including our paper in this. The paper that we wrote for that conference was called Making Do with Less, and by the way, it was co-authored by Chris Stanton and Catherine Shaw. And the basic idea there is that we know that during this recession, if we look at productivity, this recession is unlike recessions of, say, the 50s or 60s, where productivity tended to fall. And this has been a trend that's been going on over time, and we don't have much to say about that. But the question is, why has productivity continued to rise, and in some cases actually increase? If you look at 2009, 2010, you see that aggregate productivity has increased. We have data from a particular firm where we can actually look at what's happening at the firm and, in fact, at the worker level. So we can actually study whether workers are increasing their output or effort during the recession. So this is a microeconomic approach to examining what actually happens to productivity during a recession. And there are 2 possible explanations for why productivity might rise. One is a composition effect, that the changing nature of the workforce, perhaps in the direction of more skilled workers, might increase productivity. And the other is that for a given worker, productivity goes up for a variety of reasons. And what we do is we test between those 2. The bottom line is that it is the second, it's the second explanation, not the first. It's virtually all productivity per worker related. Almost none of it is a composition effect. And the reason that we offer is that it's essentially based on the threat of unemployment. And the threat of unemployment is a more compelling threat during a recession, particularly a recession like this one. So the way we test that is to look across different sites. We have a number of different sites in our plant. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the name of the firm. It's a service-based firm. You can think of this as stuff like grading, call centers, insurance claims, these kinds of people, tech people, gate agents, all of those would fit in where you can actually track the output by computer, essentially what we know is the start and end time of a particular transaction. So we know precisely how long a job took. So we have a very good measure of productivity there. What happened was different sites in this particular firm experienced different rates of unemployment. So by going across the different sites, we can figure out whether being in a high unemployment area affects your productivity by more than being in a low unemployment area. And that's basically it. That's the whole story. So here's the bottom line. Bottom line is this. The firm in question experienced about a 5% increase in productivity during this particular recession. What we found is that the impact of a 5 percentage point change in the unemployment rate, which is kind of typical if you look at the trough to peak to trough, where you're saying you had 4.4% back in the 2007 period, went to 10% at the peak, so a 5 percentage point increase is somewhere in the right range. You get about 3.5 percentage point increase in productivity explained just by this effort effect. And again, this is very specific. It's a particular kind of worker. We're not talking about the most highly skilled workers in the economy, but again, we think it is suggestive of what's actually going on in the economy as a whole. So there does seem to be this tendency to get workers to make do, the firm is able to make their workers do with less. When a particular worker leaves, others seem to be picking up the slack. And I think of that as a standard kind of labor supply issue, because if the wages remain the same but the alternative use of time goes down, you're going to increase your effort. It's kind of first order basic labor supply microeconomic stuff. All right. Next point. Jim Spletzer, my co-author on a paper that we gave at the Jackson Hole Fed conference last summer, is here. And that paper made the point that Jim introduced the conference with, talking about whether these were structural issues or frictional issues. Is it a cyclical problem? We concluded in that paper that, in fact, most of what's going on in this recession is not structural. It's actually cyclical. And the easiest way to see that is simply to look at this unemployment rate chart, which shows you what happened during the recession. Now, we've broken this down by industry. So if you look at the total experienced unemployment rate, of course, you see that went up and went up significantly. But there were certain industries that accounted for most of the rise, and they were construction, manufacturing, retail, trade, and to some extent the financial sector. What is interesting about the recession is that what went up also came down. So although we have not reverted to pre-recession unemployment rates, more than 50% of the increase in unemployment during the recession was accounted for by construction, manufacturing, and retail trade. And what is also true is that more than 50% of the recovery in unemployment rates since the turnaround was accounted for by those same industries. If it were a structural problem, you wouldn't expect to see that. You would expect to see the recovery. For example, you'd see construction workers losing their jobs, but you wouldn't see construction workers coming back when the unemployment rate fell. They would tend to stay out. You'd see the health sector and other sectors come around. So we actually look at this in a bit more detail. We have an index of mismatch. In fact, there is a significant increase in mismatch during the recession, mismatch being the vacancies don't fit the jobs. But the bottom line is that while mismatch went up during the recession, it is already back to 2005 levels. So this does not seem to be a mismatch problem. It basically looks like just a problem in demand. Let me conclude with one last point, and since we have the Wall Street Journal represented here, I'll give you a plug since you gave me one. This was a piece that was in the Wall Street Journal last week. Jim also referred to this at the very beginning in his comments, and I think this chart is really important because what it does is it shows the difference between this particular recession and all prior recessions, in fact, all prior cyclical movements. When I was a young labor economist, and I think most of us as young labor economists learned that you really should be focusing on the employment rate, not the unemployment rate, because we care about the proportion of the workforce, the labor force that's employed, not the proportion that's unemployed. Historically, that just hasn't mattered a whole lot because the unemployment rate, as you can see, was a perfect proxy for the employment rate. They moved inversely, and even the turning points are aligned. Everything kind of moved perfectly. That was true until this recession. And if you look at this recession, what you see is that the unemployment rate no longer is tracking the employment rate. The employment rate is stuck at 58.5%. It's actually 58.6%. When I say it's stuck, it's wiggled around a bit there, but it's basically stayed there for about 3 years. And so the unemployment rate decline is not a very good proxy for what's happening to employment, and it really is employment that we should be focusing on. In the long run, you care about things like demographics and so forth, but this is not long-run stuff. We're talking about high-frequency, very short duration declines that haven't come back, and that can't be explained by the demographic trends. So I'm going to just stop with those 3 points. I think that should lead us to a general discussion on a number of different things. David, I assume you can take it from here.
Before we get, I'm going to let Olivier and Justin
Yep.
speak, but I'm confused about one thing here.
Sure.
John is telling us that what made the Great Recession different is we didn't get this big burst of productivity, and you're telling us that what makes it different is we did. So I know you're talking about the same thing from different perspectives. So explain the...
I was listening to John carefully. I think what John is talking about, when he was talking about cleansing, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, but when he was talking about cleansing, what he meant was cross-sectional cleansing. So people moving from high productivity firms to low productivity firms. What we are looking at...
the other way, right?
I'm sorry, excuse me. Or maybe not, but right, sorry. What we're talking about here is within a given firm, do you figure out ways to make that particular firm more productive? So, I don't want to use the word cleansing. Again, we just prefer to call it making do with less. But within any given firm, it could also be true that even the low productivity firms, even the bad firms, are still figuring out ways to make their workers more productive. And I think that's what we're seeing here. We wouldn't argue that this is, a good thing. What we would argue is that this seems to be the way that firms are accommodating declines in demand right now. The demand for output declines, but the demand for labor seems to be declining by more because they can get the existing labor to produce more per worker. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
So I agree completely with Eddie. The kind of connection between productivity and reallocation that we're about, it does have a productivity payoff each year, but it's something that accumulates over time. So indeed, what we kind of count on is this process working year in, year out, and what we find is it's not such a big kick in any particular year, and so there's high-frequency cyclical dynamics of the sort that Eddie's talking about. But we have found that when you look over a 5-year or a 10-year horizon, there's a large fraction of aggregate productivity growth that's actually accounted for by this reallocation. And so to the extent what I'm talking about is this process has slowed down and became distorted in the Great Recession.
Okay. Olivier?
Good. I have a one-page handout which I've distributed, but I want to know how many of you have it. There was supposed to be a few more distributed, but I don't see any additional supply. How many people are far from one? How many have excess supply?
Pass them that way.
Good. Apologies for that.
We don't have one either.
What?
We don't have one up here. None of
Well,
us
All right, fake it.
do. We'll just listen to it.
sorry about that. Yes, what I'm going to do is focus on Ed's presentation and on the first fact, the fact that we just actually discussed, which is that if I look at the Great Recession, Eddie pointed out that actually productivity, output per worker, actually went up in the recession. And that's a surprising fact. But even if you look at more conventional measures, say output per worker, so it depends what measure you use. Some of them went down. One of them that he showed actually went up. But in general, what's true is that productivity declined much less in this recession than it does in usual times. I think that's the general fact. And again, we now have seen how this can be reconciled with the reallocation facts that John gave. So what Ed did starting from that was to go micro, which is his comparative advantage, and look at one unnamed firm. What I'm going to do is go macro and look at, given that I'm at the IMF, I decided I would look at the number of countries and see whether the fact is actually a more general fact, whether the US is representative of something which happened in many countries or it is special. So I'm going to make, in that context, I'm going to make 4 points. The first one is trivial, but maybe the most important point one can make, which is that the reason why, looking at about 20 countries, the reason why unemployment has stayed high is that growth has been low. So there is, given growth, there is not much looking across countries. There is not much of an unemployment puzzle. Basically, if growth is insufficient, then unemployment is not going to decline very fast. And I think that's a very important fact, because then you get to the growth puzzle. And I think there, again, there might be some growth puzzle, but again, less than some say. We know that financial crises have very long output tails. Basically, growth is very low when the shock is a financial shock. Another way of saying the same thing is that Okun's law basically has done quite well in this Great Recession across a very large number of countries. The relation between growth and the change in unemployment has remained very similar to what it was earlier in time. And here I'm relying on work by some of my colleagues and by Larry Ball. So this is where the first figure comes in. If you start by plotting across countries, I'm not going to give you a list, you have it there, the change in unemployment and the cumulated change in growth for the period of the recession for each country. So from peak to trough, you just plot that. You see absolutely nothing. I mean, you see that in Germany, for example, growth went down, but unemployment did not increase. In Spain, unemployment exploded. So you see nothing. But this reflects the fact that the coefficient of Hawkins' law is extremely different across countries. So basically, when you estimate Hawkins' law across countries, as we well know in Japan, for example, there is a very small effect of growth on unemployment. The Hawkins coefficient is 0.1. If you go to Spain, the coefficient is 0.8. So when you then use these coefficients, which you estimate, and you construct the implied behavior from Hawkins' law country by country, then you get the picture at the top. And the line is conceptually a 45-degree line, not visually. And what you see is that in general, the position of the countries in the Great Recession are not very far from the 45-degree line, right? So this is plotting the actual change on unemployment on the predicted change in unemployment using Hawkins' law. And, you have about as many points above as points below, but in general, you clearly don't have a major puzzle. Okay, so I think that's the first point. That's an important one. The second is, well, the points are not on the line, and maybe we can learn something from deviations from the line, right? Whether unemployment has been higher than predicted by these regressions. So this is the second figure. So the second figure is obtained in the same way, which is first from a regression of the change in employment on the change in output, country by country, allowing for country-specific coefficients, getting the implied movement in employment, and by implication, the implied movement in productivity. So the figure 2 basically gives you the unexpected movement in productivity given history. And so the first thing you see is the thing you saw in the previous figure, which is that there is no general pattern. It's not the case that productivity has been higher than predicted in many countries. You have points above and below the line in general. So there is no general pattern. Then the next step, which is my third point, is, well, that's an interesting set of points. Can we actually make sense of them? So if you look, you can see, for example, that the head fact is there, which is that the US is one of the countries where productivity has been unusually high given the level of output and given the way it has behaved in history. There are two other countries which are in that camp. You have Ireland and you have Estonia. Sorry. We look at small countries as well at the front. And then on the countries on the other side, you have a number of countries where, in fact, employment has declined very little, given the decline in output, or productivity has fallen much more than would be predicted by history. And the countries here, just to list them: Finland, Germany, Lithuania, Netherlands, Slovak Republic, Slovenia. Okay, so the question for me at this point is, okay, so can I explain? It's not obvious that the explanation that Ed gave for his firm is going to be able to explain why it happened in that firm, in that country, in the US, and not elsewhere. So you look for various possibilities. The first thing which comes to mind is different labor market institutions. But in principle, if they have been stable, that's already taken care of in the Hawkins law coefficient, which is that if indeed it's very easy to find higher than the Hawkins law coefficient, which has been used to get the prediction, should capture that if it's hard. So it's not going to, labor market institutions are not going to do it, obviously. Then if you look, another possibility is, and that is relevant when you look at the countries which have had unusually low productivity, is special arrangements. And this explains a number of these countries. So, for example, Finland, Germany, Slovak Republic, and Slovenia all had explicit work-sharing agreements in which they basically decided not to decrease employment as much, but just to have workers stay there, work less. So just the opposite of what Ed was describing in his firm. And in Germany, I think most of us have read about it, and the result was clearly a decline in measured productivity. When it comes to the countries above the line, it's much harder. The hypothesis, which is tempting, which I suspect is true, but I could not verify, is credit crunch, which is that in normal times you're going to hold labor because you think things are going to come back. You want to keep the workers, they have specific capital, right? And you keep them. If there's a credit crunch, it may be very, very difficult to keep them, and therefore you have to lay off more people. This would explain, and was actually given as an explanation at the time, why, for example, in the US in 2009, many firms were forced to basically get rid of labor that they would have kept had they been able to borrow the funds needed to pay them. But I must say that I have not been successful. I've used various measures of credit crunch to see whether I could explain any of the heterogeneity across countries. The US, Ireland, and Estonia all had a credit crunch, yes, but many others had as well. So it is difficult. I mean, from an econometric point of view, I got nowhere. So this was my third point. The fourth point, are there policy implications? Yeah, potentially. I mean, you see that there's a number of countries which basically avoided the large increase in unemployment through work sharing. But this came with a decrease in productivity. That's the converse side. And then the interesting question is to relate this to the work that John has done, which is what are the short-run and medium-run effects of this work-sharing arrangement? Has it basically led to a different pattern of reallocation, less reallocation along the way, and does this have a productivity cost, not only now, but down the line? And I think that that's an open question. Thank you.
Justin?
I just want to make three very simple points about three important macro relationships thinking about the labour market. So the first is, following on from where Olivier just started, the relationship between GDP growth and unemployment. Certainly in the US, we've heard time and again that Okun's law is broken. And I want to suggest that's actually more a question of GDP mismeasurement than it is actually any problem with Okun's law. I want to then turn to the relationship between employment growth and unemployment. How many jobs do we need to create in order to reduce unemployment? And argue that maybe it's less than you think. And then finally return to Eddie's claim. Eddie suggested the employment population ratio had been exactly flat throughout the recovery, and I suspect it's actually distorted more by compositional change than he let on. So what I want to do is just begin by telling some history, and this is history Eddie will remember well because he was chairman of the CEA at the time. This is what we thought we knew about GDP in real time. So these are real-time data. I'm showing you here both the blue line, which is the standard GDP measure, and the red line, which Jeremy Nalwick has convinced me is a better measure. It's gross domestic income. And we start the story here in mid-2007 when house prices had already peaked. We keep moving through 2007. And this is now the quarter the recession begins. You can imagine why Eddie found it hard to see that a recession had begun looking at these GDP numbers. This is also the point at which unemployment started to rise. This is the first point at which we started to hear complaints. Okun's law is broken. Growth is going up. Unemployment is, in fact, also going up. Let's move forward a little to this now is the monster quarter when the economy just fell apart, 2008 Q4. The initial estimate of GDP was that it only declined by 3.8%. We subsequently believe it declined by about 9%. So throughout this entire period, we have this puzzle that growth, as the BEA was telling us, was actually not that bad. And unemployment, according to the BLS, was doing terrible. What we've subsequently learned as we go forward is actually growth was dreadful through much of this period. And if you look instead at the red line, GDI, in fact, you could see that if you'd followed the income-based measure of gross domestic product, you would have seen that we were in a recession much, much earlier. And the performance of the labour market through this period of rapidly rising unemployment was enormously less puzzling. Which is to say that through the Great Recession, there are an enormous number of articles written suggesting Okun's law was broken. But if you go back with today's data, it looks like unemployment rose much as you would expect, given that we had, in fact, a steep recession. Today, we're seeing, in fact, the opposite debate. it looks like unemployment seems to be coming down, and it's coming down despite what has looked like fairly moderate growth. But again, as we get each new vintage of data, it turns out that these deviations from Okun's law are just getting revised out of the data. My favourite is, of course, if you look at the last quarter of 2012, this is a period in which we continued to reduce unemployment. The initial print of GDP was minus 0.1%. We're all puzzled again, how could unemployment be falling when GDP was falling? If you look instead at GDI, the income-based measure, in fact said that the last quarter of 2012 was a bumper time, and GDI was growing at 5.5%. So again, it looks like many of our Okun's law deviations just look like incredibly noisy early BEA data. So if we go and draw Okun's law now using the latest data, and in red I'm showing you the downturn and in green I'm showing you the recovery, it looks like the past few years have been pretty much exactly what you would have expected if you're using not the real-time data, but now our best estimates of what actually happened over the past few years. And it looks even better if you use GDI rather than GDP. Again, a point Jeremy Narwick has made. So next question I wanted to ask is, how many jobs do we need each month to reduce unemployment? You know, you hear these things like, you know, the latest jobs report comes out and, you know, if we create 160,000 jobs, people say, well, that's not enough to keep up with the rising labour force. I'm not so sure that that's right anymore. The past 3 years we've been creating jobs at 160,000 a month, and clearly the unemployment rate's been falling. So that immediately suggests that old rule of thumb is something that we need to revise. And in fact, there's an interesting piece of work by Dan Aronson at the Chicago Fed suggesting we've got to revise it fairly substantially. What he does is he looks at what's happened to the working age population and what's happened to the labour force participation rate and a couple of other technical factors, and says, what is the underlying trend in employment growth? This shows you sort of the inputs into his process. So the top left shows you the labour force participation rate and its trend. And this he's simply projected based on demographics. So this is based on age, gender, education, and so on. It's not based at all on sort of Casey Mulligan type, you know, none of us can be bothered working because we all hope to qualify for a mortgage plan that may or may not be announced in the future. Type labour supply arguments. So this is purely the mechanical demographics churning through a fairly simple standard model, and you can see that in fact it suggests that the participation should have fallen by a couple of points, or we can explain its fall by a couple of points over the past decade, and will continue to do so. The other important factor here is what's happening to population growth, which is falling from about 1.25% to 1%. And so once you take all these numbers and just churn them through the machinery, you move from the old rule of thumb that we needed to create 150,000 jobs per month to Aronson's suggestion that right now if we create 80,000 jobs a month, that will be enough to keep the unemployment rate stable. And in fact, the claim that through 2015, 2016, that could fall as low as 35,000 a month. So when we start thinking about employment statistics, it just suggests we need to be reading the data through rosier tinted glasses. You've never heard an economist say that before. And then the final thing I wanted to do was return to Eddie's comment about the unemployment rate and the employment to population ratio. Here's the data that we all find very troubling. This is what's happening to the aggregate employment rate. And Eddie's dead right, it's flatlined, and it's flatlined at 58.5%. He then said, and this is exactly the standard intuition, which is, of course, there's demographic changes going on in the background. More people are coming and hitting ages where we typically don't work. But demographic changes are also slow. When we're looking at business cycles, we don't need to think about them. Just turns out that's not quite right, because this time the demographic changes are so big. And I think that this picture overstates the case. To say that the employment population has been picking up strongly would overstate it the other way. I just want to say that there's actually been some improvement. So I'm going to do the simplest possible exercise and simply disaggregate this by age group. When you do this for 16 to 24-year-olds, and I'm going to show this so that the vertical axis has the same span on every graph. 16 to 24-year-olds, the employment population rate has risen by about 1.5 points. 25 to 34-year-olds, the employment population has risen by about 1.5 to 2 points. 35 to 40-year-olds, it's risen by about 1 point. 45 to 54-year-olds, now it's a lot flatter. And what's going on with this group is too large to actually take too seriously. Again, though, it suggests employment to population is rising. So let me return. What I want to say is the employment to population rate is actually improving, but it's only improving a bit. It's probably improving about 1.5 percentage points for each age group. By contrast, the unemployment rate's fallen 2.5, so there is still a big puzzle there. Let me stop there.
Eddie, do you want to respond to any of that Justin said before we?
No, not really. Why don't we just have a discussion?
Okay.
And then we can
Well, here's what I propose. I have a couple questions, and then I'll stop asking questions and turn it to the audience. And if the audience is quiet, I'll ask more questions. It seemed to me that both John and Eddie lead me to be profoundly depressed about the future productivity trend. Eddie tells us that all the productivity trend increase in firms came by scaring the hell out of low laggards in the workforce, and presumably that's not a lasting effect. And John tells us that all of the things that used to drive productivity after recessions didn't happen the way they usually do here. So am I misreading this? Is this a profoundly pessimistic view about trend productivity?
Can I say? I think it's too early. It's too early to say.
This is going to really cut short your journalism career.
But I do think. I mean, I think it's again. I'll come back to one of the key themes I emphasize. I do think the U.S. again has gotten a lot out of. I'll say young firms and the job creation from young firms. So let me just let me try to answer your question partly and talking a little bit more about that evidence. So what else do we know about young firms? So in any given year in the United States, there's a large pace of business entry, and indeed, can I say back in the I'll say the good old days, which weren't actually all that good, but we're better than now. We were getting roughly 3 million new jobs a year from startups alone. And then out of that wave of entry, what we tend to see is, I'll say, is what Ron Jarman and Javi Miranda and I talked about, a very rich upper-out dynamic. That is, actually, most new firms fail. Actually, even most new firms that survive don't grow. But out of that group are a group of firms that grow very rapidly, create lots of jobs, okay, and we've seen are closely tied to exactly the productivity dynamics that I'm about. Indeed, the things that are connecting reallocation and growth. And so I'm not saying that we're not getting any of these kind of interesting reallocation and productivity dynamics from large mature firms. We actually do. We do see such firms. But those young firms play a critical role in, I'll say, reinventing the United States. So this comes back again to your question of pessimism. I actually think that there is concern that we aren't seeing those kind of dynamics occur in the United States in the same way we did before. We were already seeing a decline before the Great Recession. I would say that the 2004 to 2006 period was not nearly as robust a period of either job growth or productivity growth as, for example, the late 1990s. And I think the kind of dynamics I'm talking about contributed to that. And so to the extent that we were already on a downward trend and then this kind of dynamic got hammered in the Great Recession and has been slow to recover, then there is some reason for pessimism.
Eddie?
Yeah, let me comment on two things. First, on the productivity issue, we know that productivity fundamentally has to occur through technical change. So over the long term, Solow taught us that 50 years ago. Essentially, we've got to figure out ways to get technical change high, and as long as technical change is high, we can continue to have productivity growth. The issue is, where does that come from? And historically, that's come from high investment in both human and physical capital that's helped facilitate the degree to which the economy has changed. I guess the question from a policy point of view and from a prescription point of view or prognosis point of view is whether we are going to see those kinds of investments continue to be made in the future at the rate that they were, say, in the 80s and 90s. And I to the extent that one is pessimistic, I guess that would be the side on which I'm somewhat more pessimistic. I'm concerned that we're not going to continue to see rates of investment of the sort that we've seen in the past. So that would be my one caution, I guess. Let me come back to what Olivier said, because I agree with him completely. In fact, I mentioned the work that Jim Splitzer and I did earlier in terms of trying to decide whether this was a cyclical or a structural phenomenon. And we basically said almost exactly what Olivier said, which is, we're just dead on Okun's law. If you kind of look at this stuff, this is really a low growth problem. It's not a labor market problem. And the question for the economy is really how to get the growth rate up, not so much how to get the labor market moving again. So I agree with that completely. Just one quick comment on Justin's. I don't disagree with that either. In fact, our numbers are slightly different, but the number that I've had in mind is something like on net, we're creating something like 50 to 60,000 jobs per month. You would have it at a slightly higher rate than that, but somewhere in that neighborhood. The problem with that is that if you figure we've got to make up for 8 million jobs lost, it's a long, long time before we get back to that. And so even if you use the revised numbers, we're still basically saying the same thing qualitatively, which is we still have a very long way to go before we have a normal labor market.
Justin, do you want to respond at all?
I want to agree with Eddie.
Somehow it can't be possible that everybody agrees with everybody and they say different things. But Olivier wants to say something then, John. Okay.
So two things. In response to Ed, Okun's law is actually, I think, neutral on the issue of whether the increase in unemployment is structural or cyclical. Yes. The relation between output growth and unemployment can hold whether your natural rate has remained the same or not. I just say that relation is stable, I think. On productivity pessimism, the question that David asked, again, with my IMF hat, we've looked at very many financial crises, more than 100 in the recent past. And the characteristic is that many years after the crisis, output is below the old trend. So there's a permanent effect. And when one looks, it doesn't seem to come from an increase in the natural rate of unemployment. It does not seem to come, or only for a very small proportion, from capital accumulation. And so it comes from the solo residual. And I think that's where it's easy to connect it with what John was saying, which is that if we have a crisis in which there is less job creation, then the productivity in the future will be lower. Maybe not forever, but at least for a very long time. And I think you may have identified one of the channels through which a financial crisis, even when the banking system goes back to health, still has lasting effects on productivity.
John?
So partly, you don't want us to all agree, but I think I'm agreeing with Olivier on this point that I don't think Okun's law is important to look at. I'm glad we've looked at it, but I actually don't think it tells us that much as to whether there are structural changes. I mean, if we'd gone off it, yes, that would have been a signal. And I also think that structural changes, again, can take many forms. I think all the work on mismatch, here's where I agree very much with Eddie and Jim's work, amongst others, that indeed we don't see evidence that there was substantial mismatch, I would say, across industries. But I'll come back. I know I'm a broken record on this. I think we have seen some structural changes in the economy. Remember, the reallocation dynamics that I'm about is mostly within sector. It's not between sector. Most of the reallocation is moving resources away from less productive to more productive businesses within sector, and it's related to the kind of investment in physical and human capital that Eddie was talking about. Part of that is that process is a noisy process with lots of experimentation. In terms of trying to figure out what kinds of new things work. Young firms play an important role in those dynamics. So indeed, I would sort of say the structural change that we saw going into the recession is again that young firms were already on the way down. So I would, in terms of an elasticity that's changed, so I would agree that the elasticity between output and unemployment hasn't changed, but the elasticity with respect to growth and job creation has changed.
Let me turn to the audience. I see some mics here, so we should use them. And if you have a question, would you come to the mic and tell us who you are?
I'm Alan Cyanide. It's a question for Eddie. In your micro look, and no real message, nothing on capital technological change in that particular increase in productivity that you talked about, the micro level. So I'm puzzled by that because we ought to be looking for that, and if we look at the world, the substitution of new kinds of capital for labor anecdotally is very clear. So did you look, and this relates to this threat or fear getting workers to produce more, that's a bit soft in terms of empirical evidence, somewhat subjective. I can believe it in a recession. But the real question I'm asking is about the role of technological change, particularly the new technology and the displacement of labor and the efficiency of that, the worker in that firm of one, whether you observed anything in that.
Well, I think your point is an important one for longer time periods. In the short run, we know pretty much with certainty that this firm did not change their capital structure. So we actually, first of all, we looked at the particular sites. So, you know, from a technical point of view, we got site fixed effects in there. And we also know what's happening with this firm over time through interviewing and so forth. So there wasn't a change in the capital structure. These guys are basically, you know, doing the same thing at their computer terminals that they were doing before. Over time, I would expect those kinds of changes to take place. Obviously, if labor becomes more expensive, you tend to move more in the direction of capital, and we'd expect to see that in this firm as well. I don't think that's what's accounting for what was going on in this simple, narrow case. You know, whether it would be more predictive of the economy as a whole is a different question. But here we're really quite confident that this really is increases in effort. And again, you know, the way we think about it is this is completely rational at the individual worker level. I mean, there's nothing crazy about a worker, you know, stepping up productivity if you're worried about losing your job and the alternatives just aren't very good out there. So, you know, it makes some sense, and particularly since it holds in the cross-section. That's what we found most compelling because, you know, this is not a time series result. It's actually the case that when you go from one site to another, the high unemployment sites are really the ones where you see the increase in productivity. So that's what made us think it was right. Yeah.
I wonder, you're a bunch of smart people up there. There is one structural change.
Are you excluding or including yourself from that?
Up there. I'm not saying here. I'm not saying standing here up there. There is one structural change that seems pertinent to this discussion, and that is the sharp fall off in the share of output in the business sector that is being received by workers. Do you see any connection with anything you've said, or is this simply a measurement problem?
I mean, I have a thought on that, but I'm certainly happy to let others speak. So, you guys want to go first? All right. Well, let me just answer it in the narrow context. You know, again, if I think about this particular firm and if I look at productivity, I mean, this is completely consistent with what you're saying because we know that profits did not decline in the way that we might think they would during a recession. And in part, you know, if you look at this, you could say, well, this is substituting. Kind of comes back to what Alan was saying. It's substituting the short run for the long run because at least in the short run, you can see how you can get higher productivity by getting your workers to do more. That may not be a good long-run strategy, but in the short run, it will inflate profits.
So what happened to wages in that firm?
Flat.
Right. So
Yeah.
more output,
more
profits.
Right. But again, as I say, that's a short-run kind of because you know over time, if the demands on workers go up, you would expect that you'd have to have wages rise commensurate with that. So, but not in a short-run situation. Yeah. Right.
Justin?
Yeah.
I had a thesis advisor in graduate school who wrote a paper called The Medium Run, in which Olivier interpreted declines in the labour share as being a labour demand shock. He may want to speak to that.
Take it away, Olivier.
And let me add one advertisement, which is in the next Brookings panel on economic activity. We're actually going to have a paper looking precisely at the declining labour share, and hopefully we'll have answers.
Do you remember this paper?
All I want to say
That's a good question.
this is one of the least successful papers I wrote. I think
That's a relative statement here.
It's a fascinating question. What determines the share of labor income? But I had to go at it, and in the end, I was not convinced. Nor do I understand what has happened in this crisis. Let me be humble.
Can I?
Yeah, sure, John. Why don't you then?
I want to talk a little bit about sort of both this question and Eddie's evidence on what's going on with productivity and services. And I guess I'm wondering whether partly what we're seeing is a different form of a composition effect. What do we know that's different now relative to the early 1980s is the service sector has exploded relative to the manufacturing sector. And productivity in the manufacturing sector actually kind of looked like it used to in terms of pro-cyclical productivity. So this is kind of a question for Eddie. It'd be interesting to ask the question: Is this story for his firm, and particularly connected to this, is this just what we've always seen in the service sector, and now, because we're such a service sector dominated economy, we're seeing this story, and that may be connected to the question that was just asked.
I just want to add one thing, which is the decline in labour's share is strikingly international, and it's not just the international. It's not, and it's also not just the advanced countries. We're seeing it in the emerging economies as well. The ILO had some stuff where basically every country you look at's got a sharply declining labour share over the last decade.
So this is. Oh yes, I'm sorry. I'm Chris Ursig. Visiting the IMF as a research fellow, but I'm on leave from the Federal Reserve Board. This is a comment that is directed towards Justin Wolfer's presentation, which I thought was quite interesting. I think there might be grounds for thinking that the decline in labor force participation that we've seen in the last few years has a much larger cyclical component than suggested, for instance, by the work of Aronson. And in particular, if you look at the participation rate of 35 to 4-year-old workers, for instance, that's fallen by a couple percentage points in the wake of the Great Recession. Something that was not predicted, for instance, by the BLS, looking at their longer-term projections in 2007, they were projecting some increase in the participation rate of those workers instead of the very large decrease that we saw. Moreover, if you look at state-level evidence relating unemployment to participation, you see that states that had very large increases in their unemployment rates tended to have very large falls in participation, which suggests a lot more of it was cyclical in nature. So if you believe that, there might be much greater reason for optimism going forward, that participation will eventually recover. That could be a strong catalyst for growth. That's mainly a comment, but I was wondering, by way of question, how much confidence would you put in the sort of projections that that you had there, the Aronson-based projection, which suggested a couple percentage point decline?
It's a great question. I think what Aronson's put out there is fascinating. I'm not entirely convinced. The flip side is you suggested that some large part of this could be cyclical. That can be right, that a greater downturn caused a lot of the decline in participation, but that doesn't necessarily make us confident that during the upswing we'll regain all of this. In fact, in the United States, to the extent that we've ever had hysteresis dynamics, it's not been in our unemployment rate, it's been in our employment rate. So I think the fear here is that we've knocked a bunch of these guys out of the workforce and they're going to stay out altogether.
Okay. I refuse to believe that there's not one woman in this audience who's willing to ask a question. Please, thank you.
I'm Chin-Hee Jun. I'm at the University of Houston. I had a question for John in regards to the sort of the slowdown in the job creation. Have you ever looked at the changes in demographics and whether that would sort of, because you were sort of looking at the long run change, it started in the early 2000s. So we have had a shift in demographics. Just the lack of or the slowdown in the young entrepreneurs, could that be a factor in what you're seeing?
We really haven't looked at that directly. I think actually it's a very good question. One of the complicating things about entrepreneurship is not all entrepreneurs are created equal. There's enormous heterogeneity across entrepreneurs, and actually one of the most common forms of quote unquote entrepreneurship is 55+ year olds becoming self-employed, so to speak. But can I say the evidence suggests that's not where this rich job creation dynamics is. I'm in that age group, so that's not where it's coming from. So I agree with you completely. There has been some work, for example, Jim Spletzer and Henry Hyatt have kind of looked to see whether in terms of just sort of the declining pace of worker churning, whether worker age is playing a role, and the answer is yes. Actually, it does play some role. But your question is really about the entrepreneurs themselves, and to get at that, we need to work that much harder, right? Because we need to kind of take the kind of data sets that I'm talking about and linking it up to the characteristics of business owners. That's work that can be done, but we're interested in that, but we're not there yet.
Again, if I think about the end of 2008, 2009, it was absolutely impossible for any new entrepreneur to borrow from a bank.
Right.
Literally. I mean, I had two daughters trying to do that. And they didn't succeed. So I'm just wondering how much of the low job creation can be explained this way. Do you have any way to use your data set to get at that?
So we regard that as an incredibly important question, a high priority question, is to link in financial information to our data at least at the regional level, and actually even better at the micro level. A hint that this is obviously related is that we saw that the decline in job creation for young businesses and business startups got especially clobbered in the States with the largest decline in housing prices. And we see that even once we control for local business cycle conditions. And so that's suggesting, I mean, but obviously that those were places in which, you know, it's not exactly clear what the channel was. One channel potentially is the collateral channel, but another one is just more generally those were the places where the banks were in great trouble as well. There's lots of interest in taking the kind of real data that I was talking about. So what Census good at? Census is good at getting the real data on employment and productivity and the like. They're not the place, you could say, unfortunately, that has all the balance sheet data and all the financial information. There's lots of discussions going on with folks at the Census Bureau, with other agencies in this town who have access to that balance sheet data but don't have any of the real data. So I'd sort of say one of the high priorities in the immediate future is to try to get the real side data linked up with the financial data.
Jim? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, Eddie, you had a nice chart as you spoke to the question of sectoral mismatch versus demand-side unemployment that showed many different sectors with unemployment rates rising and then declining. And I wondered, from the standpoint of many observing the economics profession talking about the labor market in the last 4 years, there was at one point enormous controversy about the extent to which this was a sectoral mismatch problem. And what I was going to ask is it the case that if we had stopped, as Justin did 2 years ago or 3 years ago and said, here's what we're seeing, was there much more scope for disagreement about the extent to which this was sectoral mismatch then than there is today? So can we take away from this the conclusion that with what we've now learned 4 years into this recovery, it's much clearer that it was not mismatched than people thought at one point along the way?
Absolutely. That's a really important point. I didn't bring the chart with me, unfortunately, but one of the things that Jim and I did in that paper was we have an index of mismatch that actually goes back almost 50 years. Jacob Mincer was sort of the first guy to think about this stuff. But many people have plotted this thing, and if you do that, and if you look at that, say, 2 years ago, what you see, first of all, is that mismatch is highly cyclic. So during a recession, mismatch goes up, and it did in the early 2000 recession, and it did in this recession. The more important point, though, I think is the one that you just mentioned, Jim, which is that while the mismatch went up significantly, it declined just as rapidly as it went up. So if we had stopped 2 years ago, we would have seen a lot of mismatch out there, and we would have said, oh my gosh, this is, we're never going to recover. Now it looks like that's just not the case.
Justin?
I actually just want to disagree. I think the first symptom of mismatch, would be emerging shortages somewhere in the economy. And if you look at the NFIB Small Business Index, you can't find a small business since the recession that has had trouble getting skilled labour. I get called by journalists about this all the time, and I say, can you tell me a single example of a single firm anywhere going through extraordinary measures to find skilled labour? And there wasn't back then, and there still isn't today.
No, I think that's wrong, so we're not agreeing on everything. What Jim and I find is that there's an excess of labor in every industry. It's just that the differential excess, which is the mismatch measure, has gone back down. So it's still the case. It's not the case that if you were to train construction workers to become nurses, all of a sudden everything would be resolved, because it's not that nurses are having such an easy time finding jobs either. So even in the health sector, which is the growing sector, you don't have excess demand. So I think that's consistent with what you're saying. But but the point is the relative differences, I think, are not so pronounced now as one would have
Last
expected.
question to Catherine.
So it's related to all of this. Catherine Rampell with the New York Times. So on the mismatch question, if mismatch has gone down, how do you explain the shift outward in the beverage curve? Yeah. I mean, I have my own theories, but I'm just curious to hear yours.
So, we also looked at that, and the answer is we don't know yet. And again, I'll just appeal to Jim's point that it may be too early to tell. We know that the beverage curve tends to have these loops. So if you look at the pattern going out, the return during a recovery is always different. It's at a higher level. The vacancy to unemployment ratio is higher during the recovery than it is during the recession itself. And that seems to be true now, and it seems to be more pronounced than in the past. But what's also true is that the recession is more pronounced than it was in the past. So we just don't know whether this is simply a more pronounced cyclical phenomenon or whether it does reflect something that's long run.
Olivier?
Yeah, I had worked a bit on the beverage curve, and there are these loops, and the amplitude of the loop varies for various reasons. I think at this stage it's reasonable to think we're on a normal loop, that there has been no shift in the underlying beverage curve as of today.
So I want to conclude the panel. I enjoyed it. I think I've learned that the one thing I draw from this is that whatever you do as a policymaker, if you rely on the data you have available, you'll make the wrong decision. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, you're fine. Thank you all.
All right, we're going to try to do a line change up here without a break. So I'll ask the next set of speakers to come up. While they're doing that, let me just say that one of the wonderful things about doing an NBER meeting like this here in DC is it does give us the opportunity for me and for the other researchers to have a chance to hear from all of you who are here in DC and in the policy world what some of the topics are that might warrant further investigation and outreach. So I would just ask you if you have inspirations or ideas, topics that in the labor area or other areas that we should be trying to undertake research on that would ultimately help inform the kinds of questions and issues that you confront, by all means at some point during the course of the proceedings try to find a chance to let us know, and we'll try to take something up on that. So, okay, I'll let the next panel come on up. Thank you. Great. I think you have a